Through the pitch black, we heard the frantic slapping of boots through rising water, followed by the heavy clink of the master keys hitting the concrete floor. The guards were abandoning us to drown. There is a specific kind of terror that occurs when the structures built to keep the outside world safe suddenly turn into an inescapable tomb. In late August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast. While the world watched the catastrophic flooding of New Orleans on television, those of us trapped inside the Orleans Parish prison experienced a forgotten, subterranean nightmare. My name is Leon. I wasn't a violent offender. I was being held on a minor, non-violent traffic warrant, waiting for a court date that would never come. When the storm made landfall, the city's infrastructure collapsed. But inside the prison, the real disaster was just beginning. The facility was designed to keep people in, which meant that when the environment turned lethal, it kept the danger in with us. By Monday night, the main power grid died, plunging the cell blocks into a thick, absolute darkness. The backup generators sputtered, drowned by the rising storm surge, and then went completely silent. The only illumination came from the violent, rhythmic flashes of lightning cutting through the high, barred windows. Then came the water. It didn't trickle in. It rushed through the lower levels like a broken dam. Within hours, the ground floor was completely submerged. The air grew thick and suffocating, smelling of stagnant river water, chemical runoff, and raw sewage as the prison's plumbing system backed up into the cells. The prison staff, overwhelmed and terrified for their own families in the drowning city, began to panic. "Secure the tiers. Nobody opens the gates," a sergeant shouted over the roar of the wind. Through the darkness, we heard the frantic slapping of boots through rising water, followed by the definitive, heavy clink of a ring of master keys dropping onto the concrete floor. The guards were abandoning their posts. They left us locked in our cages as the water continued to rise. By Tuesday morning, the water in the lower tiers had reached chest height. We were trapped in a grid of steel and concrete, completely cut off from the outside world. The heat was oppressive, hovering well over 100 degrees, and the humidity made it feel like we were breathing hot steam. Without food, clean water, or medical care, the psychological fabric of the prison disintegrated. Men began to scream, not out of anger but out of pure, unadulterated primal fear. The sound of hundreds of inmates slamming their bodies and metal cups against the steel bars echoed through the hollow corridors like a twisted symphony. From my cell on the second tier, I looked down into the murky black water below. Floating debris bumped against the bars. But it wasn't just trash. The shadow of an inmate who had drowned in a locked, solitary cell on the ground floor drifted past, his pale face illuminated by the gray daylight filtering through the storm clouds. The true horror peaked on Wednesday night. The hunger and thirst had driven everyone to the brink of insanity. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the pitch-black darkness returned with a vengeance. Suddenly, a loud metallic crack reverberated through the block. A desperate group of inmates on the upper tier had managed to use a heavy metal table leg to violently wrench open a weakened cell door. Within minutes, the block devolved into total anarchy. Gangs of predatory inmates, now free from their cells, began roaming the dark, flooded corridors. Without guards, there was no law. The prison had become a lawless island in the middle of a drowned city. I hid in the furthest corner of my cell, holding a sharpened piece of rusted privacy screen, listening to the chaos outside. Footsteps splashed through the water right outside my door. A flashlight beam, stolen from a guard station, cut through the bars, blinding me. A shadow leaned against the steel. It wasn't a rescue worker. It was an inmate covered in blood, holding a heavy iron bar. He stared at me through the dark, his breath ragged. "There's no help coming, kid," he whispered, his voice completely hollow. "We're all dying in here anyway." We weren't evacuated until Friday. When a makeshift boat finally arrived to transport us to the interstate overpass, we stepped out into a ruined, unrecognizable world. The state tried to downplay what happened inside the prison during Katrina, but those of us who survived the floodwaters will never forget the true face of a disaster. I was released 2 weeks later without charges. The city had lost my paperwork in the flood. I am free now, but whenever a heavy thunderstorm hits and the power flickers, my chest tightens. I can still taste the foul, stagnant water, and I can still hear the sound of those heavy keys hitting the floor, leaving us to drown in the dark. Through the static of the prison line, I heard my locked-up brother realize his total impotence as he wept. "Mom, I can't do anything from here. Please, just lock the doors." When the judge handed down my brother's sentence in the winter of 2012, everyone in the courtroom looked at him like his life was the one that had just ended. He was 21, a hot-headed kid who made a devastating mistake involving an armed robbery gone wrong. They shackled his ankles, marched him through a heavy steel door, and left the rest of us behind. The system treats incarceration like a clean excision, as if they remove the cancerous element from a family and leave the rest healthy. But they don't tell you about the bleeding wound left behind. My name is Brian. I was 19 at the time, living in a small, weathered rental home with our mother. The moment the prison doors closed on my brother, Leo, a profound, suffocating vulnerability settled over our house. Leo had been our protector, the heavy footsteps in the hallway that kept local predators at bay. Without him, our home felt less like a sanctuary and more like a target made of glass. The horror of having a family member in jail isn't a single explosive event. It is a slow, grinding psychological rot that erodes your sanity, piece by piece. Every day begins with a knot in your stomach. You live by the phone, terrified of the collect calls from the county facility. If the phone rings at an odd hour, your heart stops, expecting a voice to tell you your brother was stabbed in the commissary line. If the phone doesn't ring for days, the silence is even more violent, leaving your imagination to construct horrific scenarios in the dark. But the true terror didn't stay confined to the prison walls. It leaked out, tracking mud and malice into our living room. Because Leo was locked away, his debts and his enemies didn't just vanish. They shifted their gaze to us. The local crew he had mixed up with knew exactly where we lived, and more importantly, they knew we were entirely defenseless. It started 3 weeks after the sentencing. I was sitting at the kitchen table studying for an exam when I felt that primal, icy prickle of goosebumps on the back of my neck. I looked toward the window facing the alley. A man was standing under the broken street lamp. He wasn't hiding. He was just staring directly into our kitchen, his face obscured by a dark hood. When I locked eyes with him, he didn't run. He slowly reached out, tapped his knuckles against the glass pane, and vanished into the shadows. When we accepted Leo's collect call the next morning, my mother was weeping. "Leo, you have to tell us who they are," she sobbed into the receiver. "They're coming to the house. They're watching Brian." Through the static of the prison line, I heard Leo's breath hitch. It was the sound of a grown man realizing his complete and total impotence. "Mom, I can't do anything from here," he whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying mix of rage and despair. "I'm locked down 23 hours a day. Just lock the doors. Please, just lock the doors." He was screaming into a void. The steel bars kept him safe from the streets, but they kept us locked out in the cold with his ghosts. The psychological stress quickly manifested into physical illness. My mother stopped sleeping, pacing the floor with an old baseball bat until her eyes were sunken and bloodshot. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the siding sounded like a home invasion. We were prisoners in our own skin. On November 4th, the nightmare breached the threshold. We woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of shattering glass in the living room. Someone had thrown a brick through the front window. Wrapped around the brick was a handwritten note with a sickeningly brief message. "Leo owes. Pay up, or brother is next." We called the police. They arrived 2 hours later, took a mechanical, uncaring report, and told us to buy a security system we couldn't possibly afford. To them, we weren't victims. We were just the collateral damage of a criminal's household. The final shattering violation happened a week later. We returned from a brief trip to the grocery store to find our front door kicked off its hinges. The house had been systematically ransacked, but they didn't steal the television or the meager electronics. Instead, they had gone into my bedroom. My clothes were shredded and scattered across the floor. My childhood photographs were smeared with dirt. It was a calculated, sadistic message. They wanted us to know that they could touch us whenever they wanted, and the man who was supposed to protect us was rotting in a concrete box, completely blind to our suffering. Leo was released 4 years later, but the family he left behind was entirely gone. The stress permanently broke my mother's health. She passed away from a stress-induced stroke 6 months before his release. I moved 3 states away, living under an assumed name, unable to look my own brother in the eye without feeling the phantom terror of that dark alleyway. The law tells you that the perpetrator pays the price for the crime. But the chilling truth is that when someone goes to jail, their family serves the sentence right alongside them, vulnerable, violated, and utterly unprotected in the dark. Right next to my ear in the pitch black, a voice whispered in my own mother's exact tone, "Don't look behind you." The brickwork of Blackwood Penitentiary didn't just absorb the damp valley fog, it seemed to hoard it. Built in the late 1800s, its walls were thick, weeping concrete, and the air always tasted faintly of copper and industrial cleaner. For a correctional officer, working the night shift on C Block wasn't just a job. It was an exercise in sensory deprivation and sudden violent adrenaline. Marcus had been on the line for 4 years. He wasn't easily rattled. He'd handled riots, shanks, and the crushing psychological despair that hangs over a cell block like smog. But October of 2018 was different. That was the month they transferred inmate 4014, a man the paperwork called Arthur Vance, but whom the guards simply called the Whisperer. Vance wasn't a massive man, nor was he loud. He had been convicted of a series of grisly, ritualistic offenses that the state prosecutors had fought hard to keep out of the local tabloids. From the moment he was locked into cell 42 at the very end of the tier, an unsettling shift occurred on C Block. The normal nightly chorus of shouting, banging tin cups, and blaring televisions died down into an uneasy, suffocating silence. "It's like the block is holding its breath," Marcus told his partner, David, during their 2 a.m. rounds. "Look at the telemetry. Even their heart rates are up." David shrugged, shining his flashlight through the barred windows. "They're just freaked outy his rap sheet. Don't let it get to you." But it did. Because Vance didn't sleep. Every time Marcus walked past cell 42, Vance was standing. Not sitting on his bunk, not pacing. Just standing in the dead center of the cramped concrete square, staring at the solid steel door. And he was talking. A low, rhythmic, rapid-fire muttering that sounded like dry autumn leaves scraping across asphalt. By week 3, the true horror of cell 42 began to manifest. It started with the inmate in cell 40, a hardened thief named Miller. Miller started screaming in the middle of the night, claiming he could hear his dead mother calling his name from the pipes. The next night, the inmate in 44 tried to swallow a shattered light bulb because he claimed his daughter's voice was coming out of the toilet bowl, begging him to come home. Marcus noticed it on a Tuesday. He was sitting in the glass-enclosed control pod, sipping lukewarm coffee, when the intercom clicked open. "Marcus, hey man, can you pop the gate on Tier 3? I dropped my keys." David's voice crackled through the speaker. Marcus reached for the housing switch, his finger hovering over the button. Then, his eyes glanced at the security monitors. David was sitting right across from him in the pod, sound asleep, his keys securely clipped to his duty belt. Marcus's blood ran cold. He looked at the monitor for C Block. At the end of the tier, the tiny window of cell 42 was dark, but a pale shadow was pressed flat against the glass. The intercom crackled again, the voice warping, losing its David-like cadence and melting into a wet, guttural hiss. "Marcus, let us out." On October 24th, A severe thunderstorm knocked out the main power grid. The backup generators kicked in immediately, but they only supplied a fraction of the lighting. C-Block was plunged into a sickly, flickering crimson hue from the emergency lights. Marcus and David had to conduct manual physical checks every 15 minutes. The atmosphere was volatile. The inmates were weeping, praying, or screaming at the walls. When they reached the end of the tier, cell 42 was dead silent. David shone his flashlight through the narrow slit. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the small cell. It was empty. The bed was stripped. The toilet was dry. "Where the hell is he?" David whispered, his hand instinctively dropping to his chemical spray. "Control, we have a missing body in 42. Check the lock status." The radio spat back nothing but static. Marcus stepped closer, his face inches from the heavy steel door. That's when he looked up. Vance wasn't gone. He was wedged against the ceiling. His limbs were splayed out at impossible broken angles, his fingers and bare toes somehow finding purchase in the microscopic ridges of the concrete blocks. He was hovering over the doorway like a massive, starving spider. His head slowly rotated a full 90 degrees to face Marcus. His eyes were wide, completely blacked out by dilated pupils, and his mouth was stretched into a horrific, unnatural grin that split his dry lips until they bled. Before Marcus could scream, the emergency lights cut out completely. For 10 agonizing seconds, the darkness was absolute. Through the pitch black, Marcus heard the distinct, heavy thud of a body landing on the concrete floor inside the cell, followed immediately by the wet, frantic scratching of fingernails ripping against the inside of the steel door. Then, right next to Marcus's ear, outside the cell, a voice whispered in his own mother's exact tone, "Don't look behind you." The lights flickered back on. Vance was back on the floor of his cell, sitting cross-legged, staring at his own hands. David was unconscious on the floor beside Marcus, suffering from a sudden, stress-induced seizure. Marcus resigned the next morning. Vance was transferred to a maximum security psychiatric facility 2 weeks later after 3 other guards refused to work the block. To this day, Marcus cannot sleep without a fan on. He needs the white noise to drown out the terror that, if the room gets too quiet, he will hear his own voice talking back to him from the dark. In the absolute darkness of my cell, a voice scraped through the meal slot. "You're doing great in there, Thomas. Thanks for taking the fall." The justice system isn't a machine that looks for the truth. It is a machine that looks for a closed file. In the spring of 2011, I became the missing piece they forced into a puzzle that didn't fit. My name is Thomas. I was 24, working a low-wage data entry job, when my life was violently erased. A young woman named Clara, who lived 2 doors down from my apartment complex, was found brutally murdered in her bed. The crime scene was a bloodbath. Because I had once helped her carry her groceries up the stairs, and because a stray hair of mine was found on the carpet of the communal hallway, the local detectives locked onto me. They didn't look for anyone else. They manipulated timelines, coerced a neighbor into giving a false statement about my whereabouts, and painted me as an obsessed, calculating stalker. Within 3 months, I went from a quiet apartment to a concrete cell in County Max, awaiting a trial that felt like a slow-motion execution. County Max was built to break the human spirit. The air smelled of rust, vinegar, and the chemical musk of institutional soap. The noise was a physical weight, shouted threats, the heavy clack-thud of pneumatic steel doors, and the erratic, desperate weeping of men who had lost everything. As a completely innocent kid who had never even received a speeding ticket, I was a lamb tossed into a den of wolves. The inmates knew I was in for a violent crime, which made me an immediate target. The guards looked at me with open disgust, treating me with a cold mechanical cruelty. But the physical danger of the jail wasn't the scariest part. The true horror was the psychological rot of isolation. Every night, sitting on a thin plastic-wrapped mattress, I would look at the gray concrete blocks and realize the terrifying truth. The real killer was completely free. He was walking the streets, breathing fresh air, while I was suffocating in his place. By month 4, the dread morphed into something far more sinister. During the mandatory recreation hour, we were let out into a fenced concrete courtyard surrounded by a high brick wall with a mesh-covered observation gallery at the top. It was where administrative staff or visitors could look down at the inmates. On a stifling Tuesday in August, I felt a prickle of goosebumps on the back of my neck. I looked up at the observation gallery. Standing behind the wire mesh was a man. He wasn't a guard. He wore a plain dark gray hoodie, even in the blistering heat. The shadows hid his face, but his posture was perfectly still. He was looking directly at me. When I took a step back, his head tracked my movement. He slowly raised his right hand, curled his fingers, and made a tight, twisting motion. My heart violently hammered against my ribs. It was the exact specific hand gesture Clara's killer had used to sever the telephone wires outside her apartment building, a detail the police had kept strictly confidential from the media, but one my defense lawyer had mentioned to me in a locked room. The real killer hadn't just framed me. He was coming to the jail to watch his masterpiece. The horror peaked on November 12th. I was lying awake in my cell, staring at the ceiling, when the tier went entirely dark. A localized transformer blew, plunging the block into pitch blackness. The backup generators failed to kick in on my specific wing. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. Then came the sound, the distinct, slow click-clack of heavy boots walking down the tier. But there was no flashlight beam, no standard radio chatter. The footsteps stopped directly outside my cell door. I held my breath, pressed flat against the concrete wall. In the absolute darkness, I heard the faint metallic scrape of something sliding through the meal slot at the bottom of the door. A small piece of paper slid across the floor. A voice, low and agonizingly calm, scraped through the darkness. "You're doing great in there, Thomas. Thanks for taking the fall." It wasn't a guard. The footsteps retreated into the dark. When the emergency lights finally flickered back on 20 minutes later, I scrambled to the floor. It was a Polaroid photo. It was a picture of my defense attorney's car, taken from the bushes outside his home, with a bloody knife resting on the hood. 2 weeks later, the frame job collapsed. The killer, arrogant from his success, struck again. He used the exact same signature, but this time, he was caught on a hidden security camera miles away while I was locked behind bars. The state quietly dropped my charges. There was no grand apology, no press conference. They just handed me my civilian clothes in a plastic bag and opened the back door of the jail. I am free now, but the prison never truly left me. Every time I hear footsteps behind me on a quiet street or see someone in a dark hoodie, my blood turns to ice. I was saved by a fluke, but I will spend the rest of my life knowing how easily a system can bury an innocent man in the dark while the true monster watches from the gallery.